Good morning, and thank you all for having me this morning. I'd like to open with a few quotes that I feel are relevant to today's service. By all means, let's be open-minded, but not so open-minded that our brains drop out. That one from Richard Dawkins, also from Richard Dawkins. There are risks in the sheer brevity of Twitter, and it's actually quite an elegant art reducing what you have to say to 140 characters, and it's something that I quite enjoy attempting to do. This one from George Bernard Shaw. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. From Winston Churchill. If you have an important point to make, don't try to be subtle or clever. Use a pile driver. Hit the point once, then come back and hit it again. Then hit it a third time, a tremendous whack. And finally, from Nathaniel Hawthorne. Words, so innocent and powerless as they are, as standing in a dictionary, how potent for good and evil they become in the hands of one who knows how to combine them. To start off the message, I'd like to take a moment to define what I mean when I say bumper sticker wisdom. What I mean is any short but memorable phrase that people use to impart a message very quickly that can be easily digested upon first glance or first hear and can be remembered and repeated without too much thought. Examples of this include bumper stickers, protest signs and short chants, headlines, tweets, Facebook posts, particularly pictures that are captioned with short phrases on them, even PowerPoint slides, and increasingly statistics and words that, in the shortest space possible, provide insight into a philosophy or line of thinking and are easy to propagate, duplicate, and integrate into the greater consciousness of the surrounding area. Let's start off with some of the kinds of things that have caught my attention in the past year or so, to varying levels of what I personally agree or disagree with that I'll refer to under the category of bumper sticker wisdom. Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Yeah, pretty relevant, right? I didn't really plan it that way, believe it or not. I think, therefore I'm vegan. That's a little harsh, I think. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. Teach men not to rape. January 20, 2017, the end of an era. Just say no to GMOs. This one a little long. It will be a great day when our schools get all the money they need and the Air Force has to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber. That fits on a bumper sticker, I've seen it. And finally, hate is not a family value. Sayings like these must immediately capture the consumer's attention and make the presumption that what they're saying means something to the consumer of the message. But there's more to it than that. It must use colorful or strong or catchy language, words that activate the parts of your brain that cause a visceral reaction so that it's easy to remember not just by word, but by feeling, either by mnemonic devices like rhyme or something that speaks to you emotionally. So I've established the kinds of things that go into bumper sticker wisdom, but let's talk about the thought process that goes into this. You see, but can I ask you to help me for just a moment here? You see something like this. A little clumsy today. All right? But what I see is something like this. See all the white space around it? This space exists around any short phrasing, such as a self-contained tweet, on which the consumer of the information inserts their own personal biases. Because the phrase is so short, it lacks the burden of nuance and instead provides a projection space for you, the consumer. It is where you put your baggage in connection to these words. If you are, for instance, against gay marriage in this white space, you're putting a lot of positive thoughts of the nature, of course this is correct. Why would anyone think otherwise? If you take the opposite stance, you put in things like, well, that's not very nice, or I disagree, and other negative or contradictory thoughts. Now, if you take the Lauren stance, you suddenly have a very, very crowded white space. Assumes the reader has context of and agreement with Judeo-Christian mythology. Made a bad choice to wear heels today. Uses rhyme to make the phrase memorable. Ignores complexity of sexuality in terms of human relationships and power structures. Implies strong belief as statement of fact. Derived implication is that messenger is biased towards theologically based law. Was there even anyone named Steve in the Bible? Anyway, the point I'm making is these are the kind of messages I see when I see something as short as this. Thank you, bud. The point I'm endeavoring to make here is that bumper stickers and other similarly short thoughts are what I consider to be intellectually lazy. Authors of these statements rely on the consumer to do much of the writing and processing and propagating for them. And because they're so short, they take on a mirroring effect. It was short enough to say, so the amount of thinking you do about it should be equally short. I'm not saying they can't be clever or useful or correct, but they do rely on the exploitation of personal feelings and biases to be effective. There's another phrase that I'd like to introduce you to if you're not already familiar. Your mileage may vary. It's commonly used on the internet as a way of saying, you may disagree, but this is how I see it. Now, the phrase bumper sticker wisdom itself isn't new. It's been around for a lot longer than I've been able to locate on a number of articles and blogs that I've dated by a few years, though I'm sure it's not new at all. For instance, an article written for the Huffington Post in 2011 by author Vaishali, who wrote a book entitled Wisdom Rising Mused. How is it that all the great spiritual sayings can fit on a bumper sticker? Well, because the interpretation is missing. Of course, there's some irony in the idea that she spent quite a bit of space on the page on the interpretation of such sayings. For instance, she says the following. On a day without sunshine is like night, she says. If what you are giving your attention to is not setting you free, then you have not seen the truth yet, keep looking. Or if you're one of the many people who enjoys literal interpretations of things, you're not ascribing any spiritual meaning to it, you're simply smirking at the sarcasm. For a serious and more involved example, however, we can talk about a bumper sticker that says, I never knew a real hero until my sister became one. The statement is often accompanied by a pink ribbon. This one seems to imply that having breast cancer makes one a hero, since the bearer of the pink ribbon knows the person with breast cancer instead of the hero in question simply being a patient. There have been notable articles written about this phenomenon. While not the most recent, probably the most well-known was written by Barbara Ehrenreich in 2001, called Welcome to Cancerland, wherein, among the spectrum of feelings she has about the world of having breast cancer and her place in it as someone afflicted with it, she talks about the exploitation of the sick by cynical merchandisers to sell pink merchandise, and the idea that surviving cancer is not necessarily heroic. Ehrenreich spends much of the article first establishing the idea of heroism in what has sprung up to be something resembling a cultural movement. She writes, but in the seamless world of breast cancer culture, where one website links to another, from personal narratives and grassroots endeavors to the glitzy level of corporate sponsors and celebrity spokespeople, cheerfulness is more or less mandatory, dissent a kind of treason. As an experiment to test her hypothesis, she went to the Komen.org website of Susan G. Komen fame and posted that she was angry and cynical about the aspects of the medical industry related to breast cancer, as well as, in her words, sappy pink ribbons. She says that while she met with some agreement, she was mostly rebuked for this statement, that her negativity was unhelpful, and was even told by one person to go to counseling for her viewpoint. The word hero, then, becomes a shortcut. Should you view the journey of breast cancer patients as anything less than heroic, there are some that will tell you there is something wrong with you. Then groupthink is activated. To deviate is dangerous, and you run the risk of all sorts of negative effects, from gaslighting to accusations of mental issues, and in some cases, threats and harassment. Naturally, this line of thinking would extend to all the business running pink ribbon campaigns. One could assume that these goals of these campaigns are benevolent, because how could anyone in support of breast cancer research be anything but? Or could it be, say, a brand of bottled water is changing its labels from their normal color to pink for the month in, quote, support of breast cancer research, but when reading the fine print, the label says nothing about how much profit the company is giving to charity when you buy that bottle with a pink label. On the upside of this particular issue, however, there has been some backlash to this line of thinking since the article was written. There is even a website called thinkbeforeyoupink.org that calls for more transparency in the pink ribbon market. The mission statement includes the following. The campaign calls for more transparency and accountability by companies that take part in breast cancer fundraising and encourages consumers to ask critical questions about pink ribbon promotions. I didn't even know that was a thing until I researched it. Like all viewpoints, though, it's necessary to understand all sides of an issue before jumping into the fray and espousing the merit of one side while completely dismissing contradictory or conflicting viewpoints. One of the earliest messages that Reverend Kane gave to the congregation, at least as I remember, included a nod to the phrase, "We either contemplate or we exploit." The problem with this statement is that the world is not a binary place. It is entirely possible to contemplate and exploit, even if passively. When we talk about things that enter into the category of bumper sticker wisdom, we see things that, like any good form of message propagation, has the effect of engaging the heart before the brain has a chance to process the message, and oftentimes takes the brain hostage before it has a chance to join the party and possibly spoil the festivities. Let's start for a moment with a statistic. If I told you that 47% of all Atlantic County residents are victims of stabbings every year, how would you react? Okay, keep all of that in mind when I say that 47% includes people who are stabbed by needles as they sew, or as children stabbed by foam swords on a playground, or people who are metaphorically stabbed in the back. I got a few jeers from the crowd, and that was the right response in the first place, because you would think I was crazy to put out that statistic, right? I did exaggerate a little for effect there, but the point I'm making is that when accounting for everything that makes up any given statistic, the things you don't see by virtue of the brevity of the message makes that 47% statistic patently ridiculous. Because of a lack of nuance, substance, or context, it leaves you vulnerable to a certain preconception about a subject, despite the fact that the label statistic loads the idea that scientific research was made in order to obtain that number, and scientists should be trustworthy, right? Vulnerable, however, may be the wrong word, when it is ultimately your responsibility to determine how that number settles in your head before you engage with the facts. Now that we've talked a little about the concept of generalization, let's return to one of the concepts I used earlier, or one of the bumper stickers I used earlier. Teach men not to rape. This particular statement comes across to me as both rather troubling and cynical. It doesn't specify which men should be taught not to rape. The context in which I find it used often communicates that it is all men that should be taught not to rape. It doesn't say men who are at risk for criminal activity. It doesn't say men with sociopathic tendencies. It doesn't say men who have been previously convicted of rape. It simply says men, and this leaves a lot of white space for interpretation. So the way I see it is that it rejects the idea that men and boys in general know right from wrong. It seems to normalize the idea that men are perpetrators, and as such, forces the idea that women are the sole and perpetual victims. This line of thinking seems to ignore the idea that men can be rape victims, that women can be rapists, and that rape is somehow a default experience of being male. It then lends credence to the media vaulted statistics like the one that states 1 in 5 women on college campuses will be raped. Now, when we look at that 1 in 5 statistic, since it's somehow easy to think of women as overtaken by an assailant, it is also easy for a statistic like this one to set the world ablaze. How can this happen? Something must be done. Since it is news outlets that break stories like this one, it's easy to get caught up in the fervor. Remember, though, that news outlets specialize in the written word. They are paid very well to get eyes on column inches and fingers to click on web pages. Therefore, it's pretty much a given that journalists, bloggers, and anyone else who wants you to sit up and pay attention will be using generalizations and strong emotional language to get you to click on the link, or even pass the link along without any critical analysis of the information contained therein. They are extremely responsible for the structure and tone of the words that they use, and it would be naive at best to think otherwise. Because, of course, it's easy to think that 1 in 5 women can be the victim of sexual violence, except that the results of the study have been debunked by a number of sources, including the Department of Justice and Time magazine, and even the authors of the original study. The study took place in only 2 schools, hardly a national perspective, and per the authors, only 42% of those asked responded. Therefore, it is unknown if those who were sexually assaulted were more likely to respond to the survey. Therefore, the numbers could be skewed based on self-selection for participation. And here are a few other things that such brevity of message can allow a person to disregard. Stats do not make clear that perpetrators aren't a ratio of 1 to 1 with victims. And stats do not account for any male victims of sexual violence. In fact, they seem to imply strongly that it is male on male, and people often disregard female on male and homosexual relationships. I am, of course, not saying that the victimization of anyone, female or male, is acceptable and easily dismissed. All assaults to human life are tragic. However, overplaying the heinousness and asymmetry of a statistic causes worse problems: widespread panic, misunderstanding, and dividing lines between groups, wherein other groups become marginalized. I don't want to come across as particularly mean-spirited about this. We fall into these traps because people are people. We build ourselves intellectual shortcuts because life is complicated and there's a lot to know, and that we don't have time to look too far beyond a headline and determine every specific bit of information is correct. So we trust. We trust because we find trust to be a positive quality and doubt to be a negative quality. And in general, people want to be positive and hesitate to associate themselves with anything negative. But let's return to the idea that the world isn't binary. I don't just listen and believe to things I hear, or even, as I learned when I held a security clearance, trust but verify. I prefer to make sure my head is engaged before my heart is. I try to understand facts before drawing conclusions. I feel there is a certain amount of responsibility one takes on when they endorse a certain idea when they repeat it, particularly one that can be repeated easily for novelty or shock value. The easier to remember and repeat, the more white space I give it, and thus, the more I question it. Now that we've established the concept of an intellectual shortcut, I'd like to share a personal anecdote from my life about why these shortcuts in thinking can be truly damaging. When I was in 7th grade in a Catholic school of a class of about 16 kids, I had already been an outcast for about, 6 years. This is true. But in 7th grade, there was puberty, and with puberty came a whole new horizon of bullying that could be visited upon the short-haired, tomboyish-looking outcast. Attacks on sexuality. The new and inventive way to bully the weird girl was with the word lesbian. The word lesbian to a bunch of 12-year-olds was a fresh and exciting way of cutting a little girl down. It wasn't just the word, but the context. The accusatory tone, the spitting of the word across the room for the approbation of the crowd. Looking back, it's clear that these kids didn't know what it was defined as, but we all sure knew what it meant. Lesbian had a white space around it filled with words like ugly, unattractive, unlovable, and ostracize. The truly sad part is that my life had been filled with those kind of coded words that were either used against me or used to ostracize others. Words like nerd and atheist were all used in the same way and to the same end. Even the word vegetarian is met with the kind of defensiveness that says, I could never give up meat, as if my existence suddenly became a meat is murder protest rally. It took me until a research paper in high school that I understood the correct definition of lesbian, but by then, I'd been carrying around the belief in this incorrect definition for years, and it created a stigma in my mind that even though I knew what the correct definition was, I was still scared of associating with anyone who was considered to be gay or lesbian because they had, even in that small Catholic school, been defined as the other, unclean. The shortcut definition had taken over and been given a more visible life on its own, and that's when my propensity for creating white spaces started to grow. What other words were being shortcutted dishonestly to impart a new and convenient meaning? What words are being used now? What words that once we hear them, we immediately internalize and spit back out because it appeals more to a certain sense in us that we should question less and generalize more? Strangely, I found a bumper sticker in my research that fits perfectly here, and despite being succinct, it's hard to fit in a wide interpretation. Stereotypes are devices for saving a biased person the trouble of learning. When I hear about politics, for instance, I hear the word Republican as a shortcut to things like warmongering, authoritarianism, and destruction. And yet, if you asked most people what the platforms of the Republican Party are, I would wager that most people couldn't give a satisfactory definition, even people who are pro-Republican. When I hear about sexism or racism, I hear the word privilege, and I have to mentally calculate exactly how much of it I have as a biracial but predominantly white woman, and how silly I feel for abstracting and overcomplicating hatred that way, when the best of my Catholic school upbringing taught me that despite the schoolyard taunting, Jesus made few distinctions between people in his decrees. All these words with emotionally charged components that are supposed to make me sit down, shut up, and listen, because when I hear these words, I'm supposed to think a certain way about them and not question them. Because I do research on emotionally charged subjects, and I think not in only short-term fallacies, but long-term issues. So when I hear the sing-songy chants and see the protest signs, I don't immediately agree or disagree. I ask questions. I ask why. I ask what all the shouting is for. When I hear a group that isn't famously known through clear and discernible instances of malevolence, but is spoken of as it deserves hatred, I do research to make sure I'm not blindly spreading hate or ignorantly misrepresenting the subject. For instance, many of you who follow me on Facebook are aware of an incident 2 years ago in which I got into an email squabble with a local Baptist minister over the interpretation of a sign outside his church. The sign read, "An atheist cannot find God the way a thief cannot find a policeman." Let that one soak in for a second. The voice in my head said, however, I ain't saying atheists are criminals, but atheists are criminals. Imagine the furor if any other group were substituted in that space. Just imagine for a second there. How would it be perceived? It would be considered hate speech, right? So what made one group more susceptible to this kind of criticism than another? But anyway, I'm not saying that bumper sticker wisdom is always bad or doesn't have its place. But at the end of the day, the responsibility of the consumer of the message is to stop and think about what's being said before endorsing the message by repeating it. Not just listen and feel, but verify exactly what we are filling in the white space with. Logic, reason, fairness, justice, kindness, compassion, understanding, all desirable. Taking things at face value, appeals to emotion, personal biases, and self-satisfaction with the message, less so. And I would like to end with the following thought. Lest anyone think I don't do my research, by the way, I did find out whether or not there was anyone named Steve in the Bible. His mention was in Corinthians, and he was a Greek. Further, the name Steve actually derives from Stephanus, which is Greek in origin. If you decide to go with the assumption that God had only created the Garden of Eden at the time, then it stands to reason that there was no Greece to produce a Steve for Adam. Therefore, someone who says Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, from a purely logical basis, actually has a point. Your mileage, of course, may vary.